It's 8:45 on a crisp, clean spring morning. Your shoes echo along the hallway, and you've got your cup of coffee in hand, and you are ready to go. You walk up to a classroom, an empty classroom. It's locked, of course, because you showed up a little bit early because, you got to adjust for that commute at times. And as you wait, you stand there, you take a sip of your coffee, pull out your phone to look at the time, press the home button again because you actually forgot to look at the time, and you wait because it's 8:53. Slowly, students, half awake zombies basically, are showing up to the classroom and you're still waiting for the professor. And suddenly a rush of energy comes into the hallway, and this enthusiastic, passionate professor comes strolling to the door, unlocks the door, and opens it. Please open Unity and download that content that I uploaded last night. And so you eagerly go up to your seat and you're super excited, and you sit down at your computer, you pull up Unity, you start downloading the file, and other students, yeah, they're doing it too. They're still waking up. And as the professor is finally prepared and ready to go, he walks up to the front of the classroom, gazes across the eyes of bleary-eyed and excited students, and utters 4 words that can make students sometimes even shudder or cringe. Let's start assigning teams. And this is what we're talking about today. Student dev teams. Dr. Messi?
Good morning. Hi. I'm Professor Hutton, George Mason University Assistant Professor of Game Writing. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Julie's study, but I, as the mentor of her undergraduate research program, have found immense value in this. So I want to give a little bit of background for those of you that aren't in higher ed and games. Currently, at least as of 2016, there are over 400 programs. That means majors, minors, master's programs, lots of them. We all have different approaches to teaching this stuff. We all have disciplinary backgrounds. We all have different experiences with best practices. And so in many ways, we're still figuring it out. But across those programs, the one common course is Project Studio. And it's that vague. And that's still only, I think, 61%. And so collaboration is really important. So while we're all figuring out what to teach these students, the proper balance of programming, art, narrative, all those things, there's little focus currently, I shouldn't say, a lot of individuals are, on how to teach it. So that is my research on the side, but then when Julie came to me about her project,
Sorry.
The hidden clicker trick. No, back one.
Sorry.
So trying to figure out what to teach and how to teach it. My philosophy, I come from a writing background, but it's that our instruction should focus not just on what we want students to know. This is a field that is rapidly changing, and so any sort of set knowledge, it's there, and there's background that everyone should have. But we really need to focus on what we want students to do. We're getting there. Oh, sorry. Origins of this collaboration. So Julie took my Game 332 RS, Story Design for Games class. The RS means Scholarship and Research Intensive. It's part of our university's Oscar program. The Office of, hold on, I always mess this up. The Office of Student Creative Activities and Research. Yes. So it started with a student meeting. It was a typical student meeting I have all the time. If you're an educator, you probably do too. A student in a group project looking for tips on how to best engage team members. Sometimes those meetings are an issue, right? And you might have to intervene. But in Julie's case, it was more just, hey, I've never worked on a collaborative writing project like this. How do I go about this? So I shared my research with her. We ended up, Julie applied for our university undergraduate scholars research program, got funding to do a study, and then I get to stand here because of all the hard work she did. So this collaboration is really all about Julie, but in the process, and I'll talk about this later, I learned a great deal about, my practice, but also future research directions.
Sorry. Okay, so as Dr. Hudson had mentioned, my name is Julie, and I'm currently an undergraduate student at George Mason University, which is in the Northern Virginia area, if you're wondering. And I'm currently majoring in both psychology and computer game design simultaneously. And you might say, oh, but psychology and game design, they go so well together, right? Because you need to understand like psychology principles in order to design games. So like you can make scary games, right? Well, that's not entirely the reason why I started studying psychology. I wanted to understand how people work and how to best engage them and make them feel like they're empowered. And by studying both game design and psychology, I can take leadership principles and psychological phenomenon that I learned in classes and apply them to team projects as like a producer or a team lead with other students. And so when I was talking to Dr. Hudson, sorry, I flipped slides earlier. When I was talking to him, I was in the middle of a team project and I was having some issues engaging other members, and I wanted to really try to inspire them to want to do the project. So I had approached Dr. Hudson about that, and over the years, it's like sometimes teams are really successful and sometimes they aren't as successful, and I was really curious as to why that might be. So that's why I kind of developed this study where we would take several different methods and kind of smash them all together to create a wonderful amount of data and analysis. So to go over briefly what we did, what
you did.
Okay. So I had sent out student surveys for the beginning, the middle, and the end of each team project. So I talked to each of the professors, asked for permission to do it with their team projects, and after permission was given, students would get a piece of candy in return for filling out like a 6-minute survey. It talks about various different factors like their personality type, and I'll talk a little bit about like personality evaluation and leadership, how much communication they're doing, what kind of platforms they're using, like if they're using Discord or Trello or anything like that. And so that was the first part of the investigation. So that is all of the quantitative number data that we could use. And then we used professor interviews, which is where I set up an interview, had like a 30-minute chat with them about their experience in the industry or their experience teaching students and challenges they may have faced in the industry and what they see students facing as well, possible solutions, stuff like that. And we got a lot of data from those as more of a qualitative look into the data and kind of help in the analysis. And then there's also a case study group, and if you see SCATIG, which is actually a student organization on George Mason's campus, which meets weekly, and I had them fill out a survey each week about 2 minutes long about, well, are things going well? Do you believe your team can succeed? Stuff like that to really supplement the rest of the data. So as I had mentioned, we looked at team status, mental attitudes, personality types, which I'll go into a little bit more in the next slide, and how frequent communications were. So just to kind of get an overall view, it's not everything that has to do with student dev team success, but I thought those were some of the more stronger factors that contribute to a team's success. Okay, so I had mentioned personality analysis, so I'm going to talk a little bit from my psychology background to explain a little bit more about that. So I was using the Big Five personality trait theory, which was developed by McCrae and Costa, which are two psychologists, and it was in the 1990s or so, and it evaluated OCEAN, or openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is basically summarized as how creative you are, how organized you are, how much you like being around people, how much you get along with people, and how emotionally stable you are. And so they had a scale of 1 to 5 to fill out each of the little bubbles, and I got to evaluate their personality types that way. So I have the average game design student's personality listed out right here if you were interested. Well, I have it printed on the poster in the back if you want to look at it in a little bit more in depth. But like extroversion, on a scale of 1 to 5, they're at a 2.5. So they could go either way. But there's also a slightly lower score for neuroticism, which is like emotional stability. So that's a pretty interesting little tidbit that I found. So I'm not going to go too much in depth, but I thought it was interesting to look at. Now, in terms of motivation, that was a really big thing because I wanted to see if students were getting more motivated as they were getting closer to those deadlines or not so much. And turns out, in general, for all of the groups, overall motivation went down. So if you look at the green category, it's the highly motivated section. So from the beginning to the end, it significantly decreased. You can see that there's a huge difference. In addition to that, like perceived team motivation, like how motivated was your team to complete the game, it also significantly went down. But if you remember that case study group I was talking about, GADIC, they are voluntarily meeting once a week. And their individual motivation actually significantly increased, which I wasn't quite expecting because normally students feel really stressed out towards the midpoint of the semester and they may feel less motivated, but you know, it was an interesting finding. And then the perceived team motivation stayed relatively the same rather than seeing that drop, because like if you look at the red bar, which is like unmotivated entirely, it grew significantly. I also asked a question about, hey, does your team have a leader to it? And for some reason, for all of the groups, they ended up going like 50-50 yes and no for the end, when at the end of the day, you want to know that you have a team leader, or if you don't. So that was really interesting. And then for GADIC itself, like everyone was like, yes, there is a team leader. And a reason for that might be because GADIC is a well-established organization on campus, and there is an actual like hierarchy, or not, well, I'll say chain of command if you're familiar with that term, but it's like you have a president of the organization and then you have different leads for the different functional areas of the teams. So that was an interesting finding as well. So with the case study group especially, I was asking them weekly if they trusted their team members or how their thoughts were on how the progress was going. And in all areas that I had asked, there was a significant increase in their confidence in the team's success, which was a really good sign because they are voluntarily going in and completing those surveys and supporting the group.
Okay, so at first, Julie was a little surprised. We looked at the data and we saw how the GADIC, that student group that it's not for credit, they get together on top of all of their other courses, that they were more motivated. I, however, was not surprised at all. This is one of the big challenges for educators. But that intrinsic motivation, wanting to do something because you see the value in it, right? And so as educators, we hope, I suppose, to get students excited about their work. So not just, oh, I love games, I'm passionate, but oh, I see the value in that thing you're forcing me to do or I fail, right? If they're just working for grades, then that motivation isn't really there, at least in my head. So I've written about this. This is a shameless plug. But in the Power of Play, my colleague Boris Willis and I, he also teaches in the computer game design program. I have a writing background, he has a dance background. Check our chapter out. But play in the classroom is not seen as properly academic, right? We're not, well, you're not children, right? And school is very expensive. And our administrations want measurables, they want data when we go up for accreditation. However, I know, and the science tells us, that giving students an environment that is more playful and is a little more free-formed actually helps their cognitive development, right? It sort of forces that creativity, and it removes some of that hierarchy that, in the setting of higher ed, can really, it can be daunting, right? If you fail a course, and just as someone who's been in higher ed for over a decade, someone who used to do student advising, that can mean debt and not making rent and car payments, and so it's a high stress environment. So, go ahead to the next one. So, research does suggest that playful approaches allow students greater freedom. So that GADIC group, and many of them are the same students that were likely included in that other data. When they're doing it for fun, they produce better work in many cases. And so even though it is, I'm just going to keep air quoting, even though it is for fun, they're still producing something that can go in a portfolio, which is what will ultimately get them a job in the industry, right? But so when we take away some structure in the classroom, we are seen as we're seen as not really doing our jobs, right? Why would I take out, on average, I think the student loan debt today is $35,000 post-graduation. Why would I take that on to sit there and fool around with you, right? And so this is one of those challenging insights that I have, that I continue to struggle with in my classroom. How do we find a way to capture that energy of that student group that meets on their own without credit, not for academic credit? How do we take that same energy that is there, it just exists, and move that into our classroom and then amplify it with our instruction?
Okay, so I had mentioned that we were analyzing the data and everything like that, and this is what we found. So if you have a team leader that's actually like pushing the team in a direction and you're actually pursuing a plan actively, then the team is definitely going to be more successful, because people feel like, or there is possibility of a reason for that would be that people feel more empowered and that they're actually pursuing a goal. And meeting in person is very important to having a very effective environment, because those in-person interactions have a higher correlation with students being more successful. It's not causation, it's a correlation. I'm sorry if I sounded like that. And if you feel like you can actually make something, then you're going to be more likely to succeed. And that's a brief summary you can read off of my slide.
So my takeaways. Some of Jolie's study has sort of reinforced a lot of what I found in my own research. Some of it has brought up some new questions, and it's great. But if I had 3 takeaways for educators and students that can take the same lessons. Reflection. Having students think about what they're doing in the classroom, whether it's about their collaborative practices or having, thinking back on actual skills they've learned. That reflection is also vital for instructors. We have tacit knowledge, right? We got to where we are for, some reason. But especially folks that have experience in game development. They do have a wealth of knowledge and skills. But beyond anecdote, reflection takes that tacit knowledge and it can make it explicit for students. And so one of the things that Julie found through some of her interviews, many of those questions had not really been asked before, right? A lot of us in higher ed are busy meeting deadlines and doing the things we need to do. Once a student sits us down on the record, even though it's confidential, and what is your practice? The second one, be explicit with curriculum design and course scaffolding. Again, we know why we do what we do. My particular faculty, we spent every Friday, I think, for over a semester arguing about it and trying to figure out that what to teach and how to teach, right? But we also have a responsibility of when to teach it, right? And I want my students, if they pass all of their classes, I want them to finish in 4 years. I also know we have space and we have human resources that we have to be able to deploy. So rather than come up with a wish list that looks like, in 2008, the IGDA came out with their higher education framework. If you've never seen it, Google it, you can find it online. Taken in total, probably like a 9-year degree that included writing for radio and human telemetry or something. I made that last one up. But be explicit. Let students know in that syllabus, you're taking this class, so I know that you have X, Y, and Z, those prerequisites. And so now we are going to build on that, right? So even after that curriculum is in place, to make it explicit that yes, you are on a trajectory if you choose to seize that opportunity. 3, create learning environments that encourage freedom and challenge those traditional hierarchies. So the students in the case study group that were doing this outside of traditional classroom guidance, they do have a faculty mentor, but they just were able to do it on their own, did feel, or at least the data shows that there was some clearer motivation, and that actually increased as they got closer to finishing, which seems exactly what we want. So creating a classroom environment that is structured so we can ensure those learning outcomes, but still gets that special sauce that we take from students and what they already bring to the table, what we know they can do, and we let that shine through. The bonus takeaway for me, having an undergraduate, and it was funny, and Julie, it was a weird conversation. She said, "Should I interview you?" And I think we said no.
No, we said
we didn't know if.
You didn't want to spoil the data or influence the study too much.
Yeah, that's what I told her. But no, I mean, we've met weekly. It's just been a series of interviews. But having a student in your program research your program is kind of a novel idea. I got really psyched about it. It's almost subversive, right? And so having that context allows me, and my research has been, interviewing folks in the industry and trying to get a sense of their competencies in order to translate that into pedagogy. An undergraduate study like Julie's sort of gives that data and that insight, and actually working with the researcher is far more helpful than the data itself, at least in the short term, to take all of that and put it together. So that data we have from HEVGA, the Higher Education Video Game Alliance, from the IGDA, from my own research, from others' research. But when you focus on your program and serving your students, a project like this is super beneficial and a little complicated.
Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about what we could potentially do in the future. So I asked a question to professors and students unofficially if they should do team projects or individual projects from the beginning, like individual skill sets and kind of developing that skill confidence, or if they should learn how to work with other people, because game development is so heavily reliant on working on teams unless you're like Toby Fox or Scott Kaufman making the game completely by yourself. So I think looking into that a little bit more and determining what might be the best approach, or like a blend of the two and what the best balance would be, might be a good future research option. In addition to that, I had asked if students feel ready in the game development field to professors. And I was like, do you believe that the game design program currently prepares students amply for the field? And all of them basically said yes. It's like, okay, cool. Unofficially talking to students, it was a little bit more iffy. Like, I don't know if I'm gonna go into indie. I can't get an internship for AAA. Like, I'm having such a hard time with this. I am having a hard time finding a job. So having that confidence in your skills and being able to succeed in the field, no matter what you're doing, but not to an arrogant level, and kind of finding a good place for that, and staying motivated throughout the degree program. So like when you first come in, you're like, yes, I'm going to be making video games, and then by your sophomore or junior year, it's kind of like, I'm making video games and 3D modeling till 3 a.m. So maintaining that motivation and confidence. And then additionally, looking at specific skill sets, because I had asked generally what they felt about their skills, and if they were like super confident, they're like, I completely agree, I am 100% a programmer, I know how to do everything, versus like art, it was just vague categories that I had asked. So looking into specific classes and specific skills that go with those classes to kind of see how we can develop those in the future to progress students in a more effective manner. And then my personal takeaways, I had a lot of fun with this project, but it was also pretty complicated because I'm taking some classes with the professors that I interviewed. So it's kind of meta when they're like, yeah, this is my teaching approach and this is the like strategy that I do when a student's having an issue here. And it was really interesting getting that perspective because I hadn't even thought I would have the opportunity to do that. And using Oscar, I was able to blend psychology and game design together for the first time in any of my academic classes. Like, genuinely in an academic setting, I should say. But it was a fantastic opportunity for me, and if a university that you are local to provides such an opportunity for undergraduate research, take it. Take it, because you have endless amount of possibilities that you can study. Like, I didn't have to do this project, but it was something that I was interested in and I pursued it. And I feel like I can help contribute to the game design program so that in future years, students can have an even more positive experience than what I've had. So I think that pretty much summarizes the entire study that we've been conducting. So we appreciate your time and you waking up early to come listen to our talk. Do you have anything you wanted to mention?
So please, if you're in the DC area, please come check out our Senior Game Expo on May the 9th and see what they've come up with at the end of 4 years. Also, feel free to contact me with questions about Mason, with questions about undergraduate research or my own work. Other than that, I'm not too proud to beg for applause because we just finished a talk. If any, I don't see well, but if anyone came late, there are no bad questions. Feel free to, for either of us or both. Yes?
Were the teams that you studied, were they self-chosen teams or were they assigned teams by the professor?
It was a mix of both, and since they were, because of IRB, the review board, it has to remain anonymous. So some professors had assigned teams, some of them didn't, so all the data is blended together. But I did ask if you had previously known other students on the team, and there was a small correlation with knowing people prior, but it wasn't statistically significant.
And we we mentioned IRB, our internal institutional review board, but Julie did go through the process of following all the best practices of research. We were deemed exempt by the human subjects review board. But behind the scenes, this has been far more than just taking survey data with Qualtrics. Really developing this data and really building trust from my perspective from the faculty and really some of the students. Everyone is resistant to assessment. It sort of kind of feels like judgment, but because we took these steps and all of this, other than Julie and myself, all of this is anonymous, and so we're building this data to do something with, right? All data is good data. You do something with it. But yes.
Any other questions? Yes.
Can you go back to that personality one?
Oh, the average personality
Yeah.
traits? Yeah. No, this one. Yes. So people are more creative, and then people. Oh, I misread it. This one is organized, so conscientiousness. So it's a 3 out of 5, and then there's also the poster in the back if you want to take a picture of that one because it might be hard to hear.
But so one of the interesting things that came up for me, the idea. So this is all self-reported data, right? And if you are one of the haters, it's easy to say, it's just what students say. But these are very important insights. We don't want people to be egomaniacs and completely overestimate their abilities. But at the same time, student confidence going into the workforce or going into a project is important. And so the more positive feelings a student has about their particular skill set or their representation of themselves in a positive light, that really is an ideal thing, right? And when we are sitting in a curriculum development meeting, now we talk about these things, but usually we were always focused on that what to teach. Now that we're thinking more about how, we're looking at student confidence, right? And the idea that we know what we are doing, we know why we are doing it, we feel pretty good about how we're doing it. But if the students just feel like they're struggling from project to project, you lose an opportunity for that team. So a few things. So one, in assignments, be explicit, not with just directions, but that why. Like here's a task, here's the goal, and then the word count and that sort of thing. What that does, it forces you to make it explicit. I know why my students all have to do a game narrative review and try and get them to submit it to GDC, But, so you have to sit down and put that into words, and then students see. Now they might skip to the end. And how many words do I have to write? When this is due? When is this due? How much is it worth? Right? And I used to be cynical and bitter about that. You know, people just want grades. How students have been conditioned and trained, right? And so, you know, aligning your higher order learning outcomes with their tasks and being explicit about that is huge. I always check in with my students almost across the board. They do a midterm reflection and an end of the term reflection. Then we have course evals and stuff. But to get a sense of what are you benefiting from in this class, right? In many cases, I find out that it's mixed across students. Many of them find benefits in many of the things we're doing. I'd like to remind them of that in that second half of the semester, right? And in some cases, like we already had something planned. Sorry, this is for those of you who have been my students in the past. I'm opening the curtain. But you know, the 4 or 5 students will say, oh, you know, I really found the analysis of those gameplay clips really vital. The next time I do it, I'll be like, oh, you know, when Sue and Bobby, like, you know, I was gonna do it anyway, right? But letting them know that you hear them, right? I think is really important. But please, let's talk after.
In the back, yes.
So I wanted to ask about students and work ethic and motivation, because what typically happens to like fresh students is that they get so excited to work in games and all that, but they realize how hard the work is, and then they start to kind of like, you know, like kind of lack the discipline to work harder, or it's just harder than they think. So work ethic is kind of like hard for, I guess, like motivation, work ethic is kind of like hard for users to adapt to. So like any advice to like, let's train them, I guess, to have better work ethics, I guess.
So that's partially personality based. So some people are more driven than others. That's that conscientiousness score that I talked about earlier. So you can't change someone to be like way more organized. That just won't happen. But if you find what motivates them, like intrinsically, like what they want to pursue, then you can use that to really motivate them. Because if you connect on that individual level, like that individual consideration that Dr. Hudson was talking about, then they'll feel like they're important and that what they're doing matters. And at the end of the day, even if it's not the best thing, if they feel like what they're doing is important, then they will contribute.
Yeah, we're just gonna keep tag teaming these.
Yeah.
So this might this will seem to run counter to what I was saying about challenging hierarchy, but students have been conditioned to how much is this worth? What are the grades? I like to have, you know, students will submit papers that I don't grade. I just give feedback, right? And sometimes that blows their minds, but you know, I'll grade their peer feedback, right? Because I want to say that is, you know, just as important as my feedback. But then some students, like, why am I going to turn this in if it's not for a grade, right? And I used to be, I now know that is how students are motivated. That's how they've been trained. So use that. It's a carrot and a stick thing. But you know, there is something to be said for, in my writing classes especially, I always grade professionalism, which is grammar, mechanics, editing, that sort of stuff. But you know, try to give a opening assignment and just grade it like when I used to be an English comp teacher in grad school, and say like, no, like this is just a lack of dedication. I call it professionalism and not writing style, because if you don't know how to use a semicolon, look it up, right? Use spell check. But just because we do have that power structure in the classroom, to use that, because the best students will thrive, right? And challenging them. So it's really, for me, it's the idea of trying to ensure that the middle, the people that might need a little push, give them that push. In hindsight, and for any of you that are done with your education, my hardest classes were, now I realize they were my favorite and most memorable. And it is hard to be tough in class, but if you're ever a teacher, you are one now. It is important. You can always get easier. As the semester goes on, you can almost never go, harder and more strict.
Yes.
That actually leads right into what I was hoping to ask. That you say use their interests and motivations, cater to that, right? Like if you have a high skill set modeler in your class, then that person should be the modeling in the group project, right?
Yeah.
Doing what they like and are interested in doing is what produces good work.
Mhm.
What do you do for students that may not have figured out what they like?
So like a generalist?
Yes.
Well, you could always help them find a direction. Or if, like, I'm a generalist, so I just like doing an awesome job on everything that I can. So, like, if there's one or two things that they like more, then that's always something that you can consider. Also, like, team projects are structured differently between classes. Like, sometimes you have to make an entire game, or sometimes you have to, like, do Foley work for the sound clip. So it depends on the project, but I think that's...
And I think one of the insights that has come from this is to hold off on those collaborative projects. Currently, we don't do this. We're trying to figure out how in our curriculum, but to ensure with rigor that all the students have a fairly competent base skill set. Because the danger of getting into that collaborative teamwork environment too soon, there are folks that have one skill and they'll kind of do it over and over, and won't have the benefit of being able to communicate with everyone involved in production. Because that's, especially if you want to be a writer, you still need to understand those other elements and be able to talk to those folks. But the trouble, if folks self-select and specialize too early, we have a few things. One, they might get stuck doing the same thing over and over again, even though they want to grow, but in the name of the project, they know they're the one that needs to do the programming. And then in some cases, it is possible for folks to kind of hide, right? That social pressure of group work, and if somebody is really sort of slacking. I mean, I know as an instructor and all the tools that I have at my disposal to sort of discipline and encourage in a peer environment, if that motivation isn't there, that can be tough, right? And so theoretically, if someone finds themselves in groups that are sympathetic to their situation, or they just allow poor work ethic, it is possible to just kind of float, and we want to eliminate that for the second half.
Yes.
I'm from like a smaller college where students become friends very quickly because their classes are so small. I've noticed in the 2 years I've been there, at the start of the semester, the class will have like maybe 15 or so people, and a certain students will bond and become friends with other students and help each other out, whereas others won't do that. And I've noticed these are ones that will kind of fall off and they lose motivation, don't get involved with the ones that become friends do. And I was wondering if you had any advice, because I'm like new elected president for our game club, and I'm wanting to try to figure out how to get more students to interact more and try to help bring each other together, because like you said, this is a field that heavily requires communication. I know that's one of the big key points to help us succeed with that. If you have any advice from the students.
So the question was, with a smaller program especially, it can be really challenging to motivate some students because like cliques form or like friend groups form, so certain people will gravitate towards one another, and if you're not really included in that group, then you might feel less motivated. So if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like you have different needs that should be fulfilled before you can move up to the next level. And one of those is acceptance and feeling like you belong. So at that point, like it's not entirely like required to fulfill those lower levels, but they aren't able to achieve that higher level of success because they don't feel like they belong, or they don't feel like they're important to anyone else. So I personally, like, just as like aside as leadership goes, I normally try to approach people one-on-one and talk to them and try to pull them into groups. So if someone is standing over here by themselves while there's a group standing and talking over here, I'll say, hey, you want to talk with us? And even though they're not physically talking, they are next to you and they are in that circle and they'll feel a little bit more included. So just by trying to reach out to people, that can be a really good first step to make them feel more integrated into the program.
And I think, I don't think that's a problem unique to small schools. I think it is maybe a blessing in disguise that it's just more visible, right? Because, well, it seems like it's pretty obvious when it happens. But it can be quite serious. I mean, as human beings, but especially as faculty, to really keep an eye on folks' mental health, right, and their well-being, and there can be more there than just not agreeing with some folks and being off to the side, right? So just sort of a PSA for that. But this is where that structured play, right? So how do you teach this in a class? I have no idea. But if you give folks chances to get together, right? And most of us like games. And so maybe it's built around that, right? Maybe it is, play testing folks' tabletop stuff. But to encourage, or again, maybe use that stick, maybe even require that sort of unstructured free time together, I feel, and if it's built around games in this particular case, that's where we can discover commonalities, right? And things that will come up, I think, naturally in the course of play, and we can start to find some common ground. But you raise an excellent point.
Yes, sir.
So, say as a student, how would you recommend we take this data and apply it to help our team's motivation from within the team?
Well, talk to them. If you talk to them, like face to face, that's a pretty good approach in terms of like getting things rolling. And like sometimes a team won't like officially have a leader, and just kind of like taking the lead and trying to like put things out there, put out ideas, try to engage other members, can really form cohesion. So if you know the team life cycle, like forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning, if you follow sorry, if you try to follow that and like increase the speed of that forming so that people start to get to know each other a little bit sooner and mesh, then that might help.
Yeah. So essentially, you just kind of like engage with your team and bring everyone like together and like interact and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And so like that was Julie's initial question, right? And all these other great things surfaced, and that's kind of been the surprising data that we've worked with. It was Discord, everyone uses to communicate.
Most everyone uses Discord, some use Discord.
But personally, and I think the data kind of showed this, face-to-face meetings, which again, and maybe that helps also with the camaraderie and the esprit de corps thing and belonging. It is, I think, easier to disappear for a week from a Discord than it is to not show up to an agreed upon time. I don't require my students to do it, but I give them a template if they want to, that are group contracts. And let's decide like what is a reasonable time for me to reply to your email. If we are going to check Discord, what times of day, so I'll know you see it. But almost across the board, folks at least say they're going to meet once a week. But at some point, that's just a check-in that I still care, I'm still engaged because I drove here or did X, or B, I'm okay, right? And I can and we can get together and complain about our instructors, and all kinds of other stuff, whatever it is, but that face-to-face, I think, and the data we didn't go that deep into it, but I think that's vital.
And that's something else that I kind of want to look into in the future. Thank you for the questions. Anyone else? Going? Oh, yes.
So you said it was a unique experience getting the perspective of your teachers when you got to interview them.
Yes.
Going through that process, was there anything maybe consistently or even unique to one instructor anonymously that really stood out to you, maybe that all of your instructors did that maybe you weren't aware of that was interesting, or?
Something interesting is the way that they approach the conversation. So some of them saw it as there's a student talking to me about my journal. And some of them took the approach that this is a researcher who's trying to gather data about my experience and gave more honest answers, more in-depth answers that were honestly a little bit more helpful than like, here's the cliche teacher response to your question. So I would say that that's a pretty significant difference I saw between some of the interviews. And I'm planning on doing follow-ups if I have time, but it's almost the end of the semester, so we'll see how that goes.
So as a follow-up, you feel like the instructors that were more honest and open, you feel like you gained more from that experience within their class, like it added to that classroom engagement, or is it completely independent as a researcher?
I would say it gave me a greater appreciation for what they're trying to do. So if one professor does like intense feedback videos and like is really putting a lot of content out there that has a lot of individual consideration and understanding the motivation behind that, especially like the amount of time poured into that is like, I appreciate what they're doing more when they give me those in-depth responses.
I think that was one of the, after the first round of interviews that went well, that was one of the questions, I think we were looking for differences between interviews, but then I sort of was just like, what do you think they just said that because you're a student? And then that it complicated things a bit, but I think as a faculty member engaged in this process, it is tough because I do have opinions about higher education in general and what we're doing in general that I don't think are appropriate to share with a student. Because they may not be, and we've had times, I've had to apologize to Julie at least once, I think, for being like maybe a little too honest. And realizing that she's still a student, and we're researching together, and so there might be a certain day that a student doesn't need to hear a certain thing, right? This was I won't even go there. It wasn't mean. It was basically It
was honest.
It was honest. Well, no, I'm just
Very
saying.
honest.
Many times, when people complain about a curriculum, and I said it hypothetically, and it was like, well, the one answer is don't come here. Because the curriculum is the same as the day you started. And so complaining about that now, and that didn't really strike a chord. So I immediately had a post-it note for the next time I met with Julie, and I apologize for that. Though I do believe that. But my goal is to support my students first and foremost. So. It is a little weird. So, do you want to be honest with, yes, you always want to be honest, but there are different versions of the truth. Is that a thing? We live in a postmodern society, right? Anything else? Any other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, were there any questions that were geared toward whether the student had a disability of any kind?
No, ma'am.
That was not. That is data that Mason has. I call it Massey, but it's the MASI program, where folks. That particular program is for students on the autism spectrum. But when they are enrolled in our classes, that team works directly with the professor for feedback along the way. It's a pilot program right now. So they are amassing some data that they've agreed to share, but that's a terrific idea, something that could be just one of the many directions that we could build out of this study. Might be tougher to get IRB approval.
I don't think we would for that one.
Well, you can always try. Try and let them say no. But yes, that is a terrific question.
Yes, sir.
At Shawnee State, we have a big senior game that we do, and it's like 15 programmers, maybe like 10 artists. Like it's a giant team. The typical approach that has happened is that you've got sort of leads. It's kind of run like a studio. And I was just wondering, and then like a bunch of people under that, like this idea of challenging the sort of normal hierarchies. Can you think of any ways that might apply that idea to something of that size?
So, well, they call it legitimate peripheral participation, which is kind of a fancy way to say internship, right? But so taking that setup, and I assume it's a year-long project, which is one of those keys to building intrinsic motivation along the way. But for me, my tip is to build in milestones that require reflection. So asking students to write about what I've contributed so far, how I can be a better teammate, which depending on your philosophical stance background, reflection might seem dear diary, that kind of thing. But it really does, because they have to sit down and think like, am I a good teammate? I'll ask them to not rate, but rank other team members in terms of their contribution so far, with the idea that, as an instructor overseeing that, you can see the data and see if there is if there are discrepancies, right? But in many cases, most cases, kind of summarize what you found from that assignment and share it with the team, right? Because again, just like instructors have tacit knowledge that they need to make explicit through reflection, I think teams can do that as well, because sometimes it might be going very well, right? If they take the time to individually reflect on that, and then you take the time to synthesize that and share it, that's just going to increase that motivation, right? But otherwise, you have throw it at the wall, see if it sticks kind of approach. I think even if the product, even if the game at the end is the same, I think building in those reflective checkpoints makes it a deeper, more meaningful, more useful learning experience. But I'm a big reflection gal. I'll talk about it all day if you give us a chance. Yeah, we should talk. Yes, sir.
Yeah, could you just let us know about what size are the teams that you were studying? About how many people, and what was the breakup? How were the leads?
The average size was 5.
Okay.
Sometimes it was 2. Gaddick is like 60. So it was like normally between 4 to 5 people, and then like 1 team lead. Okay. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks for coming.